In this video on the causes of the U.S. Civil War, we will look at the aftermath of the U.S.-Mexico War of 1846 to 1848 and what happened in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo from 1848, the main result, which was the Mexican cession, the ceding of territory from Mexico to the United States. And in so doing, we'll look at the election of 1848, the Compromise of 1850, the election of 1852, and how that leads to the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act. First, if we look at the direct aftermath, even before the war is entirely wrapped up, the Whig Party looks for one of the generals from the war to run as their candidate. We'd already had and would continue to have a history of popular war heroes running and winning the presidency, from George Washington to Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison, who had already done it, to, in the future, presidents like Grant and Eisenhower who would succeed. But here you have the Whigs looking for someone who is not really a politician but a general, and they run Zachary Taylor, who on the issue of slavery in the federal territories, which, if you recall, is our cornerstone position leading to the Civil War, on that touchstone issue, the Whigs and Zach Taylor take no stand. Remember that all the parties up to this point had largely taken no harsh stand on slavery, typically defending or opposing it, because both parties were not sectional. There were Democrats in the North and South. There were Whigs in the North and South. And so they tended not to take a stand. So this was not out of the ordinary. The Democrats ran Lewis Cass, who stood for, in a way, popular sovereignty, sort of. That phrase hadn't quite been coined in the way it would about to be. There were others who called Lewis Cass the last Jeffersonian, sort of a small government man who wanted the government to stay out of this issue on sort of constitutional Jeffersonian grounds. More ominously in this election is former president, former vice president from Andrew Jackson, and former president in his own right, Martin Van Buren, runs on a third party ticket called the Free Soil Party. The key, so he himself is a Democrat, but he's appealing to both Democrats and Whigs, with the thing setting him apart being a platform of non-extension of slavery to the federal territories. In other ways, he's a Democrat. He was a Democratic president, and so he was a former president. He had the street cred to do that, with this one exception, that the extension of slavery was bad. Remembering that Van Buren himself is from New York, is a Northern Democrat. Who is attracted to Van Buren's third-party platform? They earned the nickname. If they were otherwise a Democratic voter, they were called barn burners. The idea being that if you would vote for him, you would let slavery was so important to you, you would burn down the whole barn to save, one horse. You would burn the barn of the Democratic Party down on this one issue of slavery. So Democrats were very critical of other Democrats who would abandon their guy in order to take a stand on slavery. Whigs who supported him were commonly known as conscience Whigs, that they themselves preferred the Whig Party, but would vote for a man who was a Democrat, Martin Van Buren. He was a Democratic president just 15 years ago. And they voted for him because of their conscience on the subject of slavery. Now, the third party doesn't win, neither does Lewis Cass. Zach Taylor wins the election of 1848. He actually dies a little over a year into his term and is succeeded by his vice president, Millard Fillmore, who ironically is virtually the only man to be president who was truly a member of the Whig Party. They only won 2 presidential elections. The 2 that they won were with generals, William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor, who had very little political standing. They were not previously big members of the Whig Party. They were sort of, generals wearing a wig, and John Tyler in the election of 1840, he was actually a Democrat, that they ran a Democrat on the Whig ticket. So ironically, Millard Fillmore, one of the lesser-known presidents, also really the only true Whig to be president from the Whig Party. After the election of 1848, this issue of slavery in the federal territories would mainly be decided by Congress. As we said, Zach Taylor and to an extent Millard Fillmore had less of a hard stand on it and would let the country and the Congress decide. But the Compromise of 1850 would be set off by the gold rush in California. In 1848, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill near San Francisco, and it sparked a massive 1849 gold rush to California near the area of San Francisco. That's where groups like the San Francisco 49ers get their name, is that those people who moved to California in this gold rush, these thousands and thousands of people, were called the 49ers because they moved to California in 1849. Now, a word about people who will drop everything and move to the other side of a continent on the hope of finding gold in the ground and striking it rich. These are not themselves rich people. They're often people without much opportunity going for them, hoping to strike it rich. You might compare this to the lottery today. People who have lots of money aren't playing lottery tickets hoping to make more money. They tend to bet more on a sure thing. So think about this in terms of the types of people. If one was a large slave owner, these are not the type of people that drop everything and move across the continent in order to hope to find gold in the ground. They're already quite wealthy and established. So of all these people moving to California in 1 year, virtually none of them own any slaves. They're desperate, poor people hoping to strike it rich. And so really quickly, California hits the number of people required in order to apply for statehood. They do. They skip all those other states in between. All those other states, the pattern of the country had been pretty straightforward from east to west, and then all of a sudden, way on the west coast, California applies to be a free state, and people are left with what to do. Some people want to reject it, but they don't have a good reason to. There aren't virtually any slaves in California. How can the federal government tell them to do it? And so in accepting California, they're left with what do they do with the rest of this Mexican cession territory? Pro-slavery people are very concerned because of all the territory in between the Louisiana Purchase and the coast. Much of that territory is desert. Much of it is mountain. California had the great farmland, the agricultural cropland in that region. And if California was closed to slavery, where would slavery even go? And so we get to those four positions. If you remember from up above, this was technically labeled position number 2, that Calhoun position. Slavery follows the flag. So in the federal territories, slavery should be guaranteed, and we should make a rule amending that. You had people like Henry Clay, the father of the Whig Party, who is still around, who is a Southerner, a Kentuckian for compromise, drawing a line, making some kind of deal. Daniel Webster, a Northerner, in favor of compromise as well. But on the other hand, taking that position number 1, you had the position that slavery should be banned, non-extended to the territories, is another Whig, soon to be Republican, William Henry Seward, who many thought would actually be the presidential nominee in 1860. He was a front runner going in before Abraham Lincoln was actually the nominee. So Seward was one of the main players in the Whig and soon to be Republican Party. And he was one of the early people to make a firm stand on the non-extension of slavery to the federal territories. And he was borderline one of these abolitionists, one of these William Lloyd Garrison people who would make the claim of God's law over man's law. It didn't matter what the Constitution said. Slavery was wrong. And they would cut through the laws and Constitution in order to make war on slavery. And so there's all of this debate going on in the Congress, and what they decide is this. They had actually put together an omnibus, or it's kind of a combined bill that failed. It had to be broken up in 1850 into 5 separate bills, because there were people who, if that one thing was in the bill, I won't vote for it. And so they had to break it up into 5 separate deals to get a simple majority for each. A couple of them had to do with Texas, but 3 of the most significant provisions are this. One is that they would admit California as a free state. Next is that everything else in the Mexican cession would be open to popular sovereignty. So the people in the territory, when they apply for a territorial government, even before statehood, they could decide whether or not to admit slavery. This didn't strike down the Missouri Compromise, but it meant that the Missouri Compromise line did not go all the way to the sea. It only covered the old Louisiana Purchase territory, meaning that the only territory guaranteed to slavery was Arkansas under the old Missouri Compromise, but that all of these future lands gained from Mexico that had been taken 2 years ago, they were all open to slavery if the people, by popular sovereignty, wanted it. And another ominous aspect of the Omnibus Bill of the Compromise of 1850 was an enhanced Fugitive Slave Act. The Constitution already required free states to participate and cooperate in returning fugitive slaves to their owners to the South. This is in the Constitution, written in the context of the full faith and credit clause, that if a state says this person is a slave, the other state has to take their word for it and believe them. In the same context that if one state says that someone has a driver's license, the other state is supposed to believe it. And so, or if one state wants someone for a crime, even if that thing is not a crime in your state, you have to deliver them up. So running away from slavery is not a crime in your state, but if it is in the state where you're from, they were expected to honor that. Well, this strengthened it, and it gave a requirement that they not only permit this to happen, but take a more active part using their authority and their people to help slave catchers return people to slavery. Even though you weren't allowed to have slavery in the free states, they were required by U.S. law to cooperate in returning people to slavery. All of these things lumped together become the Compromise of 1850. The other part of it had to do with Texas and how they were constitutionally making a provision that they were allowed to break up Texas into more than one state if they needed to add southern slave-supporting senators. That was the logic behind it. That doesn't end up coming up, but it was part of this bill. The election that follows in 1852, in some ways, you would think would be a referendum on, do we like this compromise? And yet again, neither party takes a major stand. Franklin Pierce, a northern New Hampshire Democrat, versus Winfield Scott, a southern Virginia Whig, go at it in the election of 1852. Yet again, the Whigs trying to capitalize on a war hero, another hero of the Mexican War, Winfield Scott. Franklin Pierce, the Democrat, wins. Both sides were defending the Compromise of 1850. Both sides say, let's not have slavery, tear the country apart, tear the party apart. The Compromise of 1850 is final. Now we're done. The country isn't expanding for a while, and this is not going to tear the country apart until we get to Kansas. Congress is going to organize the Kansas and Nebraska territories. Kansas and Nebraska are not part of the Mexican cession. They're part of the old Louisiana Purchase territory. And discussing the Kansas-Nebraska Act and how this will lead to open violence as a precursor to the Civil War will be our topic for next time. Thanks for watching.